Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Pale. Thanks for being with us. Today I'm joined by Joshua Spivak, author of the Recall Elections blog and a senior fellow at the Hugh L. Carey Institute at Wagner College. Joshua follows the recall landscape just about as close as anyone in the field. I know I've been reading his stuff for more than a decade. We had him on the show in January to talk about 2023, which was a big year for recalls. He's back with us today to take a sneak peek look at what we've seen this year in recalls and what we think it foretells about what's to come in 2025 and beyond. So, Joshua, great to have you on the show today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me back. Great to be back.
So we could talk about recalls all day, but let's just tell our listeners a little bit at first. What is so interesting to you about recalls, and why should our listeners care about this kind of under the surface part of our American political system?
So recalls are really kind of a fundamental question in politics. Should an official be a representative, somebody who you're electing to tout your interests and push what you think is best, and they're the best person for that job? Or should the official be a trustee, somebody who you're electing because they are the best person for the job? They have the best opinions. They have the greatest knowledge. The recall is very much about the representative or advocate model. And that is very much where we've gone as a society, and frankly, where the entire system of government has gone since, almost time immemorial. But certainly, as long as we've been thinking of politics, really, that people want their own opinions counted, and they want an elected official or an appointed official or a king or whoever to represent them personally and consider their own situations rather than the situation of simply the greater good in that official's minds. They are most of the time local issues. They are most of the time based on who that, a policy issue. It's almost always a policy issue. And you really see local government in action and local opinions in action.
Yeah, the vast majority of Americans, I would say, understand and know about recalls from hearing about the sort of big national stories that get attention once in a while. Scott Walker's recall or Gavin Newsom's recall. But, to your point, the vast majority of recalls, both attempted and successful, are extremely local, very, very small, governmental entities. So I think that's a really interesting part of the recall environment, right?
Yeah, yes. And you do see national issues crop up very frequently. Right now, we're seeing a lot with LGBTQ issues with schools. We saw during COVID, that was where you really saw COVID in action, the question of how the policy should be dealt with, and voter anger, and also voter acceptance, because most of the officials who faced a recall, and there are only a few, survived those recalls. So that's where you really see these things happen. There was a couple last year, there was a recall over the development of a battery company in Wisconsin, I believe, and it was by a Chinese company, or perhaps it was Michigan. I think it was Wisconsin. And this was a very big issue, and you could see kind of the anti-China investment there in a way that you don't see it maybe in the elections until the elections creep up on you.
Okay, so you kind of alluded to it already, but what have been some of the interesting recalls that have stood out to you this year? Because what we, and you alluded to this just now, what we learned in 2022 is there were quite a significant number of school board recalls related to COVID and how the pandemic was handled in the school systems from both sides of the issue. What have we learned, or what have you seen stand out to you from this year's recall cycle as we kind of march toward the end of 2024?
So this year, the two by far standout recalls are the Oakland mayor and Alameda County DA. Like people who follow these things would have paid attention to that.
Yep.
Crime, criminal justice issues were the focus. Both of them were overwhelmingly removed. We don't have the final numbers, but they clearly lost. There's some real questions on the replacement because California changed the law in 2022. So This is going to be a real interesting development.
Yeah, so let's unpack all this for a second. So for our listeners, Oakland and Alameda had recalls this year, and these are two of the largest jurisdictions to successfully recall, in Oakland's case, the mayor, and Alameda's case, the DA. So can you just tell us just a sort of background about those two recalls for a minute?
Both of them were about criminal justice issues and the feeling that they were not hitting crime hard enough. The Alameda County DA, which you kind of wonder if Oakland got swept up in the tide of the Alameda County DA. She, Pamela Price, was you would call a progressive prosecutor, part of the progressive prosecutor movement, which really started in 2017 in Philadelphia. And there's been a number of them throughout the country. Chesa Boudin, who was removed with a recall, George Gascon in LA, who lost, and just we've seen a number of them. And it's very interesting, frankly, that this movement developed. It was pretty much the opposite of what people would think of as a DA. A DA historically has been this hard-charging official, tough on crime, and they're saying, no, we need to think of criminal justice in a very different way. And the result was, and this is really kind of almost par for the course for the recall, it makes sense, pushback. So the voters elected them, and suddenly other voters said, hey, wait, that's not what we're looking for in a DA. So we're seeing these recalls, and, the Oakland mayor is part of that, but I think the Alameda County DA was the big one. She was successful in winning election, and then this happened, and she lost, and she is out. She acknowledged it yesterday. That was a big recall. Now, to the point about policy, I think this is a really good example of one. If people will say this was a partisan issue, but when you think about it, if Alameda was electing Ken Paxton, the Texas Attorney General, if that was the person on the other side, well, then Price probably isn't facing a recall. Price may win the recall. It's really that here's a policy issue, and since we're a very liberal jurisdiction, we don't think that we're going to elect somebody who's particularly conservative in a way that's uncomfortable to us. That's where policy works. And to the nation, that's where it blew up in their face. They had a very conservative candidate on the ballot, and Californians weren't going to go for that.
Well, yeah, so you kind of alluded to this, and this is kind of interesting. The California state legislature recently changed the laws governing recalls. Previously, the way Californians saw recalls was you had a long list of candidates as many basically as who qualified. It was very easy to qualify, which is why the Newsom recall and the Schwarzenegger recall had a significant number of candidates on the ballot. And voters were now faced with like a yes, no, and who are they going to vote for? In this case, they're only getting a do you want to recall this official. Am I summarizing that right, I believe?
Yes. So the change was interesting. So this is only for local races, not for state and the governor races or state legislature. They removed the provision. What it was, I guess, there's a number of different ways to do a recall, a lot of different ways. What California had is what I'd call a same day, a 1 day, 2 vote question. You have the yes or no, and then you have the replacement race, and the person running in the recall cannot run in the replacement race. Some places, Massachusetts famously, has it where they can run. And in 2019, somebody lost the recall, replaced themselves on the same day in Fall River. So that was interesting. The California legislature got kind of upset with the recall after Gray Davis, after Josh Newman, a state senator, lost. That's really kind of the impetus. And then Gavin Newsom, though in many ways the Democrats couldn't have worked out better for them than the Gavin Newsom recall. It just, they really helped them out in 2022, frankly. But what they did was they just got rid of the provision for a recall for a replacement vote and said it will be filled by law. So however you do a normal vacancy, that's how it will be filled. Now, some localities could get out of this. If they are a charter city or a charter county, they could have their own laws. But a lot of them then tie in, like Oakland does and like Alameda did, they tie into the state law. And now it is really kind of unclear. And there's a lot of points that are unclear here, including, I would say, whether the person could run in the replacement race, self-replace themselves, if there is a replacement race. So we're going to see this really play out. One problem is that now you have a replacement race. Oakland has their vacancy involves a replacement race. that's going to cost a lot of money that they didn't want to spend with much lower voter turnout than in a presidential election. So I don't know how well this was thought out, frankly.
Well, and one thing this is kind of speculative in nature, but it's sort of, it's a little bit of the foreshadowing of what do we think might be lying ahead in the recall area. But I don't think the California legislature made these changes with the intent to lead to more successful recalls. But
Right.
the
And now,
speculation after what you're seeing here, it sounds like it might be that some of these recalls were successful because there was no opponent on the ballot. And does that then lead to more successful recalls in years ahead? We'll be able to objectively measure that because we know what percentage of recalls have been successful over the years. But that's kind of interesting. What do you think that brings?
so yeah, I do think they were just hoping that there would be less recalls because you don't get to run. Maybe the thought was, oh, the person who's pushing the recall is going to do the replacing. They want to be in office. That's not how it usually works. That happens sometimes, but not how it usually works. What they really wanted, I think, is what Oregon has. Oregon, there's no replacement race. It's just whoever, like the school board appoints one, which is what will happen in California. But Oregon has basically the same number of recalls as California, even though it's a much smaller state since I've been counting in 2011. So it doesn't work. And what we've seen since then in 2023, 2024, there's been 22 recalls, and most of them are successful. So it doesn't seem to have affected anything except voters were angry when they found out. California also has been very, very successful for recall proponents. Before Election Day, I've counted 79% of recalls have succeeded, 103 out of 130 once they got to the ballot. That's not including people resign, so that's even more. So California is a state where recalls really are popular, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and I'm sure you'll jump in on areas that I missed, but for our listeners just to understand, each state has a very different climate surrounding recalls that factor into what drives the volume of them. For instance, how easy is it to qualify for the ballot? How easy is it to collect signatures that are needed? What are the rules that govern all that? What's the general vibe in the state around the concept of recall? So there's a lot of different factors that go into, well, why does California and Oregon and Michigan have so many recalls, but other states don't have so many? It's not just because one state's elected officials are more bad actors than others. It's primarily around, I would say, the rules that are governing all of that. But what did I miss, Joshua?
Yeah, that's true. And I think there's also just the history. People are used to it. So recalls, if you look at where they developed in the West and the Midwest, like Michigan, Wisconsin. If you see the states that don't have recalls, almost all of them are on the East Coast. My theory here is that the Western states developed very differently because they developed quickly. So there were overarching powers that could only be fought with direct democracy. In California, famously, the Southern Pacific Railroad. New York, for example, by the time of the Progressive Era, by the time of the Constitution, by the time of, 1700, there were multiply different groups fighting it out for power. You had burriers, you had bankers, you had shippers, all of these different people. So a recall wasn't going to have the same impact, or it wasn't going to be as exciting to them because they knew there were a lot of different players involved.
Yeah, we see a lot of that with initiatives and referendum as well, which are much more common on the West Coast, I think specifically and precisely for the reasons you just laid out about how those states were founded, how those constitutions were structured, and sort of what the culture is in those states. What other trends and observations do you have on this year's recalls? I think from what we've seen so far, it sounds like there's been kind of a return to normal, but also more recalls successfully getting on the ballot and more recalls than being successful to remove the office holder. But what are you seeing?
I think a lot of that may be that it's an election year. Sometimes there's kind of a blow up, an increase during a presidential election year. The biggest year that I'd seen was 2012. So maybe that's not a surprise. This year right now we have about 330 recalls that I've counted, but it'll end up being 400. Plus we miss a number. This always happens. It's impossible to track. And of those, that was the attempts. Of those that got to the ballot, about 110 110 or so are on the ballot, 100 and something like that. 74 resulted in removal. 30 resulted with the person surviving, 12 resignations, and there's like 5 outstanding, a couple from Election Day where Arizona and California still haven't voted, still haven't finished counting. But for the most part, that is somewhat in line with last year, not exactly, but somewhat in line with last year. And we're seeing, again, officials just usually lose. One thing that was interesting this year, especially with the Alameda recall, it seemed like they pushed it off so that it would be on a general election day, which makes sense for a financial point of view, that it's cheaper. But there's also a belief that if it's held on a general election day, you are more likely to survive. And this is totally wrong. From 2011 till now, I've seen it that 67% of the time when it gets to the ballot on a general election day, you're removed. 57% of the time when it's on as a standalone special, which is really shocking to my mind.
That is interesting to check out. And that ties a little bit into something we've talked about on this podcast before, which is consolidation of election dates. So yeah, if there are some states that are moving towards having consolidated elections, of course, recalls are probably a little harder to push onto a consolidated election day, but still, that's pretty fascinating. So what about next year and 26? What do you see with the future recalls? Do you think that are any new trends emerging? Are we going to see more recalls, fewer recalls? If you had to kind of guess and predict,
I kind of think
what would you say?
It's going to be pretty much the same. I think that there will be a trend towards more recalls, but only on the margins, simply because more people will know about them. That's really what it is. I think that maybe the Gray Davis recall kind of opened the door to people knowing about it just because Arnold Schwarzenegger was there. Really, that was a big moment. We're seeing, as I said, that the LGBTQ issue is really kind of keeps on popping up. In fact, there was one in Calexico, California, where that was a transgendered official was removed. And I don't know that was the only reason or even the real main reason for the recall, but that was at least talked about quite a bit. So that could be something that really crops up. Generally, it's development issues. It's hiring and firing city managers and other employees or police officers. It's things like groundwater. There's been a number against coroners. Attempts against plumbers.
Very localized issues, to your point. Yes, these are hyper-specific, and because they're so local, it's kind of hard to therefore predict because they're very decentralized and local.
Right, and there was one. So there is this too. Like last year and this year, there was a union-on-union fight. This year was in Anaheim, where there was also a Disney World component to it. Unsurprisingly, that and both of these officials survived. And last year was Oregon state legislator. I don't know how else to describe that, but unions using this issue and then other unions defending the official is kind of an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, we've certainly seen it over the last 15 years. We have seen recalls take place more commonly at higher office levels, state legislators and state executives, at a higher rate than I think occurred in the earlier part of the 20th century. So,
Yep, and
it'll be very interesting to see what comes ahead. So, all right. Well, Joshua, thanks so much for your time today. Great to have you on the show, and we'll have to have you back on again to continue to talk recalls in the future. Have a great Thanksgiving and holiday season.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me on.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our recall coverage at the link in our show notes, and you can find a link to Joshua Spivak's coverage as well in our show notes. We'll be back later this week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen or watch podcasts. I'm Jeff Pallais, and thanks for listening.